For me, as a world historian, it's telling that the College Board, in its organization of the course, put Europe last in this introductory unit. I think they did this for several reasons. First, I think that Europe's position relative to other regions in 1200 is pretty low. While China, Dar al-Islam, Mali, and the Indian Ocean are experiencing basically golden ages, Europe is riding the struggle bus for real. Secondly, I think that they did this because it's a world history course. There already are courses on US history and European history, and this one's different. It's not always the Europe show, and I think this partially makes that clear. When we make everything about Europe, it's called Eurocentrism, putting Europe in the middle. And it's important that as world historians, we make sure that Europe's position is always in the greater context rather than given priority. Because as people in the United States, we tend to associate more with European culture. So it's easier for us to fall victim to Eurocentrism. So with that out of the way, let's chat about Europe in and around 1200. So after the fall of the Roman Empire, there wasn't really a political entity that could fill the vacuum left behind. Because of this, Europe descended into a variety of small, localized states that were very decentralized. By decentralized, I mean that there was no central governing authority. They didn't have an umbrella empire ruling from a capital somewhere. Instead, all of these small polities were independent and largely self-sufficient. Many of them had begun as Roman outposts or as Roman villas surrounded by their country estates. Other remnants of the Roman world remained as well. Romans were wide practitioners of slavery. They enslaved war captives and criminals pretty regularly for both domestic and agricultural work. As the great metropolises of the Roman world gave way to small independent kingdoms, huge numbers of people left the cities and retreated to the countryside, where they could assume the position of a Roman agricultural slave. However, in this new medieval version, there were some differences. For example, the new class of agricultural peasants or serfs were not technically enslaved. Instead, they were considered individuals with rights, but not property that could be bought or sold. Those rights, however, were very limited. A serf was tied to the land where he or she was born and had to provide labor for their lord. For that labor, the serf expected to be cared for and protected. This reciprocal exchange and relationship was the basis of medieval European social and political structure and was called feudalism. Essentially, feudalism works like this. Land is owned by a king. However, because of everyone's reduced circumstances, the king doesn't have the military or economic resources to manage all of his land. So he divides it up amongst his supporters, to whom he grants lands, counts, dukes, etc. They cannot manage all this land, so they further subdivide it amongst their knights. Those knights are busy training to be knights, and so they can't actually work the land. So they have serfs farm it. So down the hierarchy goes land and protection, and back up the hierarchy goes labor and allegiance. Everyone stays in their place. Everyone knows their role. It's a nice, stable, organized system for a world sorely lacking in stability and organization. And you never know when the Vikings or other semi-nomadic groups from Central Asia are going to attack. Hope you have a strong castle to run to. Feudalism was a social and political system, whereas manorialism is the economic system that dominated medieval Europe. Each lord or knight or whatever had an estate, and on that estate was the manor house. It was like each little lord's little castle. Each estate was basically self-sufficient. It had its own bakery that made bread from grain grown on the estate. It had its own blacksmith, its own orchard, its own church, its own butcher, and so on. This system emerged because long-distance trade was not a thing. There was no central authority, remember? So there's no overarching power to control and protect and maintain the roads. Basically, long-distance trade isn't safe, so self-sufficiency is key. Life in feudal Europe was good if you were a lord. It wasn't super great if you were a serf. Serfs sometimes managed to challenge the system, but they didn't really do so effectively until after the plague devastated Europe. In one such rebellion in England in 1381, they sought to put an end to serfdom, but it was pretty brutally put down. Other revolts sparked up in the Holy Roman Empire, modern Germany, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Hungary, and the Iberian Peninsula, but they were also unsuccessful. It seems that while serfdom continued, noble landowners after this did begin to consider less exploitative forms of agricultural labor. Some new methods of farming were also being developed at this time, and they helped support the poor serfs and lead to a more commercial and interconnected European economy. New agricultural methods included the three-field system, which rotated crops between 3 fields, so 2 were growing food and 1 was resting. The horse collar, which enabled the use of horses with plows as opposed to slow and stupid oxen. And a new heavy plow, which increased agricultural productivity and led to a population increase. Because agriculture was more productive, fewer people needed to farm, freeing them up to produce other goods and services. This, coupled with the population increase, started leading to more urbanization in Europe again. Trade crafts such as textiles, metal goods, and other crafts could be made for a market economy as opposed to being limited to within the manor. As these developments are occurring, Europe is also on a collision course both with itself and with its neighbors. The small independent polities were quickly becoming larger and more integrated kingdoms that mimic what we think of the map of Europe looking like today. As these kingdoms grew, it became apparent that what had been holding them culturally together since the fall of Rome, their Christian faith, would no longer be enough to stop larger wars from occurring. In order to prevent this, the Pope, leader of the Catholic Church, which was the only acceptable form of Christianity in Europe at the time, he sought to unite Europeans against an external enemy, in this case, the Muslims. This began a series of wars in the Middle East known as the Crusades, where European Christians sought to dislodge the Abbasid caliphs from the Holy Land. Largely unsuccessful at reconquering the land for any extended period of time, the Crusades did firmly bring Europe back into the fold of the Silk Road trade routes and result in Europe becoming increasingly more comfortable with its pre-Christian past of Greek and Roman science and philosophy. These factors are largely considered to be part of what prompted the Renaissance that began, well, most scholars would say anyway, in the beginning of the 1400s in Italy, starting Europe on a path from fragmented to fantastically wealthy in a matter of a few centuries. Speaking of the Crusades, it reminds me that there's one very important factor in medieval European life that we haven't touched on, the role of Christianity. As I previously mentioned, the Christian faith provided the glue that held European society together in the wake of its political collapse and decentralization. Because of this, the institution of the church, capital C church, gained huge prominence and influence. The Pope, or highest ranking Catholic leader, who lived in Rome and was said by Catholics to be God's chosen representative on earth, was seen as infallible, as in he could do no wrong. His approval was needed if he wanted to be king, and he could limit a king's power by threatening excommunication, which is removal from the church, if you were doing something he didn't like. The church was caretaker not only of people's immortal souls, kind of important, but also the most educated, wealthy, largest landowning, and helpful institution in medieval Europe. If you were sick, you went to a monastery to be cared for by monks. If you were starving, the church helped you. If you wanted to educate your sons, not your daughters, the church did that. Their control was all-consuming, and it resulted in a relative level of corruption and dissatisfaction and competition within royal and noble families of Europe for several centuries. This separation of church and state, so to speak, set Europe apart from the Muslim Middle East, which easily combined politics and religion. That's not to say that religion didn't seriously influence politics. Kings would claim to be chosen by God to lead and rule the people who were their political flock, the same way that the priests, they were the priests' religious flock. It was an uneasy give and take that would continue to dominate Europe's political landscape for several more centuries.